Style is another variable in sociolinguistics. So by variable, we mean a feature beyond language that can account for why language varies either between individuals or within individuals. And style has been particularly important for accounting for intra-speaker variation, the ways that people speak differently in different situations and at different times. Style has changed and evolved over the course of linguistics and specifically sociolinguistics to be one of the defining variables that we use to account for meaning in language and change in language and variation in language at different phases of sociolinguistic study. Style emerges as a central feature in Labov's work in New York City that started sociolinguistics in its current sense as a discipline in many ways. So in Labov's interviews in New York City, among the variables he was looking at was R-fulness or R-lessness. This is whether or not people pronounce R as a consonant when it occurs before another consonant. So whether or not the R in a word like cart is pronounced as a consonant or vocalized. If it's pronounced like a consonant, that speaker is using an R-full pronunciation. If it's pronounced as a vowel, as it is in standard British Englishes normally, and as it traditionally had been in New York City Englishes, then that speaker is R-less. So in Labov's interviews in New York City in the 1960s, Labov set a series of tasks, and these show up in his study as task A, B, C, D, and D apostrophe, which correspond to different levels of conscious attention to speech. So at A, speakers were engaged in tasks where Labov thought that they were not actually paying attention to the task of being interviewed. These were moments when they sort of got distracted from interview questions, when they were perhaps talking to somebody else who walked in while they were interviewed, or they took a phone call. B was more formal interview tasks where a person was still responding in a narrative manner. So these were responses to questions about demographic backgrounds, responses to some specific questions about childhood or experiences in New York City. C was yet a more attention-demanding task where interviewees were reading a passage of text. In D, interviewees were reading a word list, so reading individual words one by one. And then what's labeled here D apostrophe, these were minimal pairs tasks where people were reading pairs of words that might or might not have differed on the basis of one allophone or one phoneme, and then we're giving a conscious evaluation of whether these words sounded the same or different. So for instance, in New Yorkers, for this variable, they might have had the pair God, like the thing in the Bible that made all of creation, and guard, like something that looks after something else. And they would read God, guard, and then make a determination of whether they sounded the same or different. And if a person was totally R-less, then those would sound the same. If the person was R-full, then guard and God would sound different. And so Labov, in this particular work on this, stratifies the responses to this according to socioeconomic classes you've already worked through. The yellow band corresponds to his highest socioeconomic class. This is lower middle class. The blue here is upper working class, and then the black is on the scale lower working class. So on the scale, the socioeconomically lowest position. And what you get across this band is all speakers participating in this community-wide pattern of being mostly R-less as they pay the least attention to speech, and then increasingly R-full as the amount of speech, as the amount of attention to speech that they're paying to the task that they're engaged in and the language they're using increases. So less R-full in totally conversational tasks, and certainly most R-full in the context of minimal pairs pronunciations where they're really very conscious of the fact that they're doing something linguistic. Labov interprets this community-wide pattern of using the more standard variants of production as a function of speakers' self-monitoring. In other words, the amount of attention speakers are paying to their speech drives them to use the more standard linguistic variable. And therefore, Labov suggests that attention to speech is the key to intra-speaker variation. And intra-speaker variation can be accounted for as a function of how much attention the speaker is paying to their own speech. He differentiates in this category between, in this perspective, between indicators and markers. An indicator is a community variable that people are unconscious of, and generally, he would expect that an indicator, speakers might shift a bit more in the direction of the more formal and more prestigious variant in terms as they spend more attention to speech, but generally because people won't be monitoring their speech and monitoring for this variable in their own speech, it'll remain fairly flat as attention to speech changes. A marker in this conceptualization is a feature of a community which has risen above the level of consciousness. So this is something that people associate with their dialect, and it is something that's perhaps stigmatized. And if it is stigmatized, then as people pay more attention to their own speech, then they'll shift away and shift in the direction of the more formal, or in Labov's conceptualization, less vernacular feature. So this shows up here because in Labov's conceptualization, our fullness and our lessness are markers. So R is a linguistic variable that is a marker of New York speech, and our lessness, pronouncing R as a vowel rather than a consonant, which was, again, historically the high prestige feature in New York City, has undergone a change after World War II and has become a stigmatized marker of New York City speech. And because of this, across the community, as everybody pays more attention to their own speech, they will tend to shift away from the lower prestige variant and in the direction of the higher prestige variant. Put another way, in terms of Labov's interest in the vernacular, which is this idea of the way people speak normally, the way people speak when they're not thinking about their own language. People will use vernacular features when they're paying a relatively small amount of attention to speech, and people will use fewer vernacular features as they pay more attention to speech. So this is the initial conceptualization of style. What you see across this pattern is a community shift in the variables that speakers choose, which reflects different styles of use of language. And Labov accounts for that difference as a result of speakers' consciousness of specific variables being marked within the linguistic community and trying to avoid those as they pay more attention to speech. An important secondary feature that emerges out of this is this pattern here that you see the lower middle class involved in. What happens with the lower middle class is they're participating in the general community trend as we go through unconscious speech, careful interview speech, and reading passage speech. But then when they get to these two highest attention to speech tasks within the interview, they shoot up and attain to a level of formality or non-vernacularity that greatly outpaces where they should be, which would be on the basis of here, if they were sort of to continue the pattern that they showed over the other attention to speech tasks. And indeed, they outpace even the upper working class, the group that had been most non-vernacular, most standard in its usage of this variable in unconscious speech. Labov refers to this pattern as hypercorrection, and this becomes a characteristic in Labovian perspectives on style and the role of attention to speech in driving intra-speaker variation, that groups of people who are on the socially interior portions of society, or people who occupy the border spaces where they're just on the cusp of being in a lower socioeconomic class or a lower prestige group, and also on the border of being in a more elite social class or a more socially elite group, will perform this pattern of hypercorrection when they're paying a lot of attention to speech. And Labov's account for this is, if you're lower middle class, your goal socially is to become upper middle class. And one of the ways that you help yourself elevate your position from lower middle class into upper middle class is by trying to mimic the speech of upper middle class people, and doing that in particular when you're thinking about your language the most. And what happens here is they just miss the target. They try to shoot for an upper middle class norm of production, but overshoot it and become even less vernacular than the upper working class, and even more standard. So because of this role of attention to speech in driving people in terms of how they vary along this continuum of vernacular, how they talk normally when they're with their friends, when they're with their family, when they're not thinking about their language, to highly non-vernacular features in these contexts where they're spending a lot of attention to speech. Markers will drive this because as people focus more on their speech, they'll try to avoid negatively marked variants. The community will show this pattern in general of moving away from vernacularity as they move toward more formal speech. But the socially marginal classes, the groups right in the middle, which will tend to be lower middle class and perhaps upper working class in this kind of conceptualization, will very often show this hypercorrection pattern where they overshoot the socially most prestigious group as a way to try to achieve upward mobility. This pattern that Labov finds is replicated in many studies across the history of sociolinguistics, but particularly in the early studies. So this is a graphing of one of Peter Treadgold's variants that he looked at in Norwich, and of course one of the early and very famous studies of sociolinguistics from the Labovian perspectives in the United Kingdom. And this is looking at whether the ending on present progressive verbs is an alveolar or a velar consonant, so whether a word like running is realized as runnin versus running. The lower positions on here reflect alveolar productions like run-in, and the productions closer to 100 correspond to the less vernacular, more standard velar consonant like running. And again, Treadgold stratifies his speakers according to socioeconomic class. And again, we get this community pattern of moving from more vernacular realizations in relatively unconscious interview tasks where people aren't spending a lot of focusing a lot of attention on their own language, and then the entire community becoming less vernacular, moving in the direction of the socially standard non-vernacular variant as they focus more attention on their speech, particularly in reading passages and word lists where there's a great deal of attention to speech. Of course, he's divided this into 5 socioeconomic classes: middle class, lower middle class, upper working class, middle working class, and lower working class. And again, you get this pattern of hypercorrection in a socially interior group. Here it's the upper working class that while in these relatively low attention to speech tasks, patterns basically with other working class speakers at the highest attention to speech tasks of reading passage and word lists. They greatly exceed sort of the expected rate of standardization that we see in the other working class groups, and jump up almost to the level of lower middle class groups. So again, a socially interior group, a group on the social margins, hypercorrecting to make their speech more like a more socioeconomically prestigious group, and doing that specifically in the context of higher attention to speech. This shows up in an early study of Persian. So the prestigious feature is to produce the a vowel as a when it occurs before sh. So ash, while the innovative and marked variant in Tehran Persian in the 1970s is to produce this in a raised position like a, so rather than ash, aish. And again, for all social groups in the task with the least attention to speech, you get nearly categorical productions of a, the new and marked variant, and then with increasing attention to speech, speakers move categorically in the direction of the prestigious a variant. I found this as well in my work on vowel mergers in Kansas City in the United States. And so in this case, I'm looking at the differences between speakers who perceive differences between words like bowl with the goat vowel and bowl with the foot vowel. So the difference between the word for bowl, like you eat cereal and soup, and bowl, like a male cow with horns that can gore you. And these are representations of acoustic productions, and they're divided between relatively high attention to speech tasks of word list reading and minimal pairs reading, and compared with conversational speech and reading passage. And what we see is that for speakers who claim that they do perceive a difference between these two vowels, we get clearly that across all attention to speech tasks, they have three separate phonemes that are realized in exactly the relative positions that we'd expect them to be perceived in. But for speakers who judge bowl and bowl to be close, in other words, to be a little bit different, but not totally different, what we get is when they're not paying attention to speech, they realize these bowl words, foot with an L after it, down in the space of bowl, down in the space where they would produce other goat vowel words. However, when they're paying more attention to speech, they change their production of these bowl words, the foot words with the following L, and sort of move them back into the space where other speakers would produce them. So when not paying much attention to their speech, they demonstrate the merger, but when they're paying more attention to speech, they introduce a difference where they normally might not have one. And once again, these are early studies, but that they demonstrate some spread of this around the world. So Cedar Green's important studies in Panama, Macaulay's work in Glasgow, which is also an early study in the UK, and then Wolfram's work in Detroit are very important early studies in this. And so again, the key takeaway here is in this first phase of sociolinguistics, style is a variable, and the function of that variable is that it's driven by attention to speech. And speakers will change their style of speech on the basis of how closely they're monitoring their own language. And as they spend more mental energy thinking about language itself, their language will shift away from the vernacular variant and in the direction of non-vernacular, more standard variants. The attention to speech model, though, gets challenged. And we can look at challenges to this within Labov's own work. And so also published in his landmark 1966 study of New York City, he reprints his study of artfulness in New York City department stores. So this is where he walked into 3 department stores in New York City and asked employees within these stores questions that would cause them to say the 4th floor. So for instance, in Saks Fifth Avenue, women's hosiery was on the 4th floor, and so Labov would walk up to an employee and say, "Excuse me, can you tell me where women's hosiery is?" And they would say 4th floor, and he would note quietly while they weren't looking whether or not they pronounced the R in 4th and floor. In that interaction, as soon as they said 4th floor, he would immediately say, "Excuse me," so pretending not to have heard what they said, so that they would repeat themselves saying 4th floor. So you'd get 4th floor, or, can you tell me where women's hosiery is? It's on the 4th floor. Excuse me, 4th floor. So you get these two utterances, and again, make a note of artfulness. So Labov does find, or at least he argues, that there's an increase in artfulness, which again is the prestigious variant incoming in New York City, at least clearly inclines in this second repetition. And his contention here is that in this second repetition, the employees are paying more attention to their speech than they are in the first utterance of it, and that drives them to be more artful, move more in the direction of the incoming prestigious variant. There's some reasons to challenge this, though. So in this conceptualization, Saks is the high prestige store, Macy's the sort of what we'd associate with the middle class store, and Klein's is the working class store, certainly in its clientele and pricing, and these are consistent. What's noteworthy here is that Labov's narrative for attention to speech does work a little bit on Klein's, but it's more problematic, or it's more problematic on Macy's and Saks for sure. So perhaps you get a little bit more standard non-vernacular on the higher attention to speech fourth in Saks than you do on the lower attention to speech fourth in Saks. And likewise in Macy's, you could say the same about floor in lower attention to speech and higher attention to speech. But that pattern is not consistent across these. So it's a more tenuous argument. The other thing that's interesting to note in this argument is that Labov himself is artful. So Labov is from New Jersey. He's talking to New Yorkers, and he's from a part of New Jersey where artfulness, pronouncing R in preconsonantal consonants as a consonant, is the norm. So he's himself a native user of the incoming standard variant. And so it's worth noting that at the moment where Labov has pretended not to understand people, they would have sort of extra recourse to draw on the fact that he is an artful speaker, and perhaps they would move in the direction of the more artful production as a matter of changing their speech to suit him. So there's some reasons, both in this interpretation of the data, that it's not so straightforwardly that as people spend more attention to speech, they shift in the direction of the more standard non-vernacular variant. It's also worthwhile to take into account Labov's language and to consider that speakers might be changing their language in recognition of what his language variety is. Linguists in the early 80s continued to point to potentially problematic points in Labov's analysis. And so in addition to my challenge that I'm giving, that there may be more that's going on and maybe a closer interrogation of Labov's data is necessary, a number of linguists also problematized some of his assumptions about what was happening across his interview tasks, those things that he was labeling unconscious speech in level A and careful speech in level B. First of all, it's not so straightforward exactly what the boundary lines would be, how you would say that when I'm talking to you about the place that I grew up, that I'm speaking carefully, but yet if I go into a narrative about childhood games I used to play, that would be more casual and more conversational. That notion of whether Labov's questions he was asking it becomes especially salient because many researchers challenged whether the questions Labov was asking, which he very fundamentally believed were good at producing conversational speech, were good at getting people to talk without thinking about the fact that they were using language and being interviewed. Many sociolinguists sort of began to challenge whether that was working. So for instance, and most prominently, the question that Labov believed was most successful in eliciting unconscious casual speech was a question about death and dying. Have you ever been in a situation where you thought this might be it? And he believed in New York that this sort of sent people into, sort of that
that space, that emotional moment of being afraid of being killed. Treadgold, in his study at Norwich, has a funny moment where he points out that this question didn't really work in Norwich, because it turns out that a lot fewer people in Norwich have a reason to be afraid that they're going to die than their counterparts in New York City. But there's also sort of a more thoughtful point. I mean, if you have many of us will have experiences of having sort of a formative moment, a key moment in life that we've thought about a lot and told the story of many times, and we can fall into a pattern of sort of fossilizing the story so that we tell it as a narrative. And if we're doing that, if we're sort of performing this story for people, then it's not so clear that we're talking casually in the same way that we might do if we're talking about sports or just shooting the breeze or having fun. So there's initial questions and challenges. Alan Bell also points to some empirical evidence that, again, Labov had used to substantiate his claims about the role of attention to speech, and challenged that it might not, strictly speaking, be the role of how focused someone was on their own talk. So this is Alan Bell's 1984 reprinting and reinterpretation of some work that a researcher named Moll did in the 1970s, which Labov used to substantiate his view. In this study, people were recorded giving a reading passage, and this reading passage contained instances of the variable th. So this is the th sound at the beginning of a word like think. It is a marker of New York City speech, and particularly associated with non-prestigious white working class speech in New York City, that th will be produced as a stopped variant. So ta, a word like think, will be produced like tink. This is of course, featured many working class white Englishes in the United States. Is also maybe familiar to you as an association of regional English in Ireland, a feature of Irish English. But in the study, people are reading this passage. It would contain words like think. They're being recorded, so you can analyze whether they say the interdental think or an alveolar plosive tink in this. And as they read these passages, they're wearing headphones. And in one condition, in this table, the no noise condition, there's no noise in the headphones, it's silent. In the other, white noise, so static, a hissy sound is being played in the headphone, loud enough that the person can't actually hear what they're saying. And Labov compares these two conditions here, where you have no noise in the headphones and noise in the headphones, and points out that when people are able to hear themselves, they produce a higher percentage of the standard variant, the interdental fricative, than when they can't monitor their own speech because there's noise. So when they can hear themselves, they are more likely to say the standard interdental th in a word like think. When they can't hear themselves because of the white noise being played over the microphone, they're more likely to use the non-standard alveolar stop t like tink in a word like think. And so this fact that people can't pay attention to speech, and when they can't pay attention to speech, they're unable to monitor themselves, and they move in, they vary in the direction of the vernacular variant. Labov suggests substantiates his claim about attention to speech driving style. But what Bell points out is that there was another set of conditions for this, and that was whether the person participating in the study was facing the interviewer, the person who is conducting the study, or whether they were turned away from them. And what Bell points out is there's actually a much more dramatic difference between the standardness or vernacularity of the person when they're facing the interviewer versus when they're not facing the interviewer. So in both conditions,
when the person is looking at the interviewer, they use the standard variant more. And when they're turned away from the interviewer, they're using the vernacular variant more. And these shifts in the direction of the vernacular variant when not facing the interviewer, Bell points out, are much more dramatic and substantial than these relatively small shifts. And this shift, by the way, in the wrong direction that we get from monitoring speech. So Bell is going to generally challenge this idea that the amount of attention that speakers are paying to speech accounts for differences in style, and that the Labovian conceptualization of attention to speech as driving intra-speaker variation is wrong. We further problematize this by pointing to some of the assumptions about speaker agency in Labovian model. To an extent, Labov's model of attention to speech suggests we'll sort of unconsciously move in the direction of standard features based on how much attention to our speech we're paying, regardless of sort of differences in individuals, regardless of sort of what we're trying to do in language, regardless of the situation that we're in. So we're sort of passive agents in our own language. And later generations of sociolinguists are going to problematize this assumption and point out that speakers do have agency in language. Speakers do use language to do different things at different times and use language in different situations differently. And that across speakers, we will not all vary in the same ways in the same predictable pattern that Labov finds when he puts speakers together and looks at them at the community level. So Bell is going to explore this relationship between attention to speech and something else to account for variation. His observation that in this study of white noise being played, the most important factor was whether or not the person talking was looking at their interviewer or not. He looks, among other things, at TD deletion in New Zealand. So TD deletion, sometimes referred to as here as consonant cluster reduction, is a feature of all Englishes around the world, where when a group of consonants occurs, as it does in the two consonant sounds at the end of a word like west, as in the cardinal direction, east, and its opposite, west. In both of these, at the end of this word, you have a consonant cluster. And all Englishes around the world allow for that consonant cluster to be reduced in its complexity and its sound. And it's usually by deleting the T or in cases of words like hand, the D. And so he's looking at rates of consonant cluster reduction. And of course, because of the ideas of speech precision, retaining that consonant cluster, so saying the west in the word west is more prescriptively prestigious than deleting that and realizing a word like west as west. He looks at the levels of consonant cluster reduction among broadcasters on New Zealand radio stations. So this is different radio stations, and you get their demographic profiles over here. So the important ones for our purposes will be these two YA stations, which are sort of your public radio, culturally prestigious radio stations that play a lot of news and classical music and that sort of thing, and are targeted to a listenership of older, more highly educated, more socioeconomically elite listeners, and compare those to ZB, which are more community-oriented, less prestigious, more sort of middle of the road in terms of target audience demographics, socioeconomically and in age, more younger people, more middle-aged people, more upper working class, lower middle class people. So we'll be comparing these two ZB variants against these two YA variants, and you get this pattern of the highest social prestige group using the most prestigious, most standard features, so retaining more of their consonant clusters, producing t or d more often. And in these younger, more community-oriented, less socially elite radio stations, you get more deletion, more movement in the shift of the vernacular. So that doesn't vary too much from Labov. And here we have a closer look at it, and these are just different phonetic environments that have different effects on how much T and D are deleted. And here you get this pattern by the YA radio station. Again, that's at this highest end of the socioeconomic continuum, and the ZB, which is deleting more and deleting more consistently and across all potential sites of deletion than YA. And once again, that's here, that's at this sort of middle position. So this in and of itself just sort of repeats what we saw before. So this is the more socioeconomically elite and older radio station, and it's using the standard production of t and d more. This is the less elite, more middle ground, more socioeconomically middle and younger radio station, and it's using the vernacular feature more. Specifically, Bell is working with news readings here, and those news readings are coming from the BBC World Service. So this is a script. It's disseminated around the world by BBC, and then the radio speakers use it. So that's an important point here, because it means that these broadcasters are reading the same script, the same words, would have the same orthography as these. So we have a control set of language, and in the same linguistic task, the same script, the same words, the same function of reading the news to the audience, we have variation driven by what the conceptualization of the audience is. And newsreaders provide more standard readings when speaking to the higher prestige audience, and less prestigious, more vernacular pronunciations when talking to a socioeconomically less and socially less prestigious group. So that's interesting, and Bell will point to the way that broadcasters are conceptualizing their audience as driving that. Now, that's all useful in and of itself, because that challenges the idea that attention to speech is what's driving variation, because again, it's the same task, the same linguistic function. There's no difference in attention to speech between these guys reading the news over the radio and these guys reading the news over the radio. The only difference is how these people, who the audience for this reading is and who the audience for this reading is, and variation patterns the social prestige of the perceived audience of these radio stations. So that's important. That rejects attention to speech as an explanation of the way that style drives intra-speaker variation, and shifts it in the direction of audience as driving variation. However, there's an even more crucial detail in this, and that is that these guys here reading the news at this level and these guys here reading the news at this level are the same news readers. So these two radio stations are located in the same building across the hall from each other. The broadcasters reading the news would go from this radio station reading the BBC News script, and then as soon as they're done, walk across the hall and go to this radio station and read the news script, or vice versa. The order is not terribly important here. So it's not just the same attention to speech task. It's not just the same linguistic set of words and stories. It's actually the same people, and their rates of consonant cluster reduction differ strictly on the basis of who the audience is that they think they're talking to. Bell finds this for a number of features. So an incoming variant, marked variant in New Zealand at the time, is T being realized as a flap. So this is associated with the American production of T when it occurs between vowels. So a word like water, the drink, being produced as water. And this is an incoming feature in New Zealand at this time.
And again, the same broadcasters, the same human beings use more of the standard version, the non-flapped version that's associated with British English when speaking to the higher prestige audiences on the YA radio stations, and then move in the direction of the incoming marked variant that's associated with English when they speak on the younger, more socially middle ground. So again, it's the same people, but when their audience changes, they change in the direction of the more vernacular standard. So this perspective that Bell conceptualizes is codified as audience design. While the Labovian model is talked about as the attention-to-speech model, the audience design model suggests that intra-speaker variation arises as a function of people adjusting their language on the basis of the norms of the person that they're talking to. This can function at a number of levels. So Bell conceptualizes audience not necessarily as a person who's being directly spoken to, but as a person who could function at several levels of distance from a speaker. And a speaker might be varying on the basis of designing their language to any of these levels of audience. So an addressee is someone a speaker is talking directly to. An auditor is someone a speaker knows that they're talking to, but they're not talking directly to that person. So you can imagine this is if we're standing in a group at a party and I'm speaking, the person I'm directly talking to is my addressee, and the people standing just around them who are clearly participating in the conversation, we're not having a one-on-one discussion about the topic, they're auditors. They overhear, but they're not participating directly. There's another level removed. These are overhearers. These are people who are not immediately acknowledged as part of the conversation, but are known to the speaker to be potentially hearing. So in this party analogy, this could be the people, the person standing behind me while I'm talking. I know they can hear me, but I'm also not really acknowledging them as part of our conversation. But yet it is possible, if this person is somebody who, I really respect their opinion, I really, care what they think, I might monitor and change my speech in their direction to suit their norms. And finally, there can be eavesdroppers, and so these will be people that a speaker is not aware of and therefore can't accommodate their speech to. This gets wrapped into a larger perspective of communication accommodation theory, which becomes very important and was hugely influential, especially in the 1980s and 1990s. And communication accommodation theory will make use of the concept of convergence and divergence as processes that speakers engage in. And so importantly, in Alan Bell's model, a speaker of audience design, a speaker will move in the direction of the norms of the person, the audience that they have conceptualized themselves as addressing. In communication accommodation theory, we recognize that we can change our language in the direction of another person, and if we do that, we're converging with them. But we can also introduce distance. We can speak more differently from them to introduce distance and separation from ourselves. And so a basic expectation of communication accommodation theory is that there will be this sort of negotiation going on between interlocutors, whereas they like each other and want to become more close and more engaged with each other, more mutually participatory, they'll converge and speak more alike to each other. And if things are going wrong and they need to introduce distance and separation between themselves, they'll diverge and make their linguistic practices more dissimilar. So communication accommodation theory is this offshoot, this broader theorization of audience design. Bell shows that the same speaker will vary in their linguistic productions as a result of the audience. Communication accommodation theory broadens that out to say when we speak more like the person that we're talking to, when we speak more like our audience, we're engaging in a practice of convergence. And of course, that can be a two-way street, and hopefully usually will be. Or we can strategically shift our language away or unconsciously shift our language away from that person and engage in a process of divergence, which will introduce linguistic differences and thereby also introduce social distances. So again, a number of studies recognize the role of audience design or communication accommodation in different ways as affecting speech. So Trudgill looks back at his Norwich data, and rather than looking at the speech of his informants, strictly speaking, as he does in his early work, he looks at his own language during interviews, and he looks at productions of t as a glottal stop. So now a word like water becomes wa. And what he finds is that there's a reasonably good correlation between the amount of glottal replacement that his interviewees does and the amount of glottal replacement in his own speech. So it's not only that they the different speakers in his studies are using glottals at different levels, but Trudgill himself, as he's interviewing, shifts his own language in the direction of his addressees. This actually is a really important consequence for sociolinguistic studies, because if the interviewer is shifting their language and changing their direction in the direction of the person they're interviewing, then it's probably happening the other way around as well. So this means that by interviewing someone, I may actually be causing their language to change if they're accommodating to me, or rather if they're converging with me, or because I'm a dislikable person, diverging away from me. But either way, my linguistic practices as an interviewer might be affecting the linguistic practices of the person I'm interviewing. So it raises a big methodological question about what we're actually getting when we do things like sociolinguistic interviews. Some really influential early studies by Nick Copeland in Cardiff. So here he looks at age dropping, which is a marker in Cardiff Welsh English, and he examines one assistant. This is a person taking phone calls. This is at a travel agency, taking phone calls from clients. And crucially, so these striped lines show the assistant's level of H dropping, and higher bars correspond to more dropped H's. So the less standard, more vernacular variant. And consistently, when a client calls in, the assistant adjusts their participation in the less standard variant in the direction of the client. So when a client drops H more, the assistant also drops H more, and conversely, when the client drops H less, the assistant also drops H less. Likewise, in alveolar versus velar ing, the sound at the end of progressive verbs like running, run-in versus running, the assistant seems to have a default level down here, but then as some clients begin to use increasing levels of the less standard alveolar variant, the assistant also once again increases to meet their speech. So it becomes more standard, moving in the direction of accommodating to clients. Likewise, with constant cluster reduction, so again, another variable that Bell looked at in New Zealand, again, see the same pattern, that the assistant is moving in the direction of the clients. And finally, for the T intervocalically being realized as a flap, so again, the case of water being realized as water, once again, the assistant moves their speech in the direction of the clients, and as they become less standard, the assistant also becomes less standard, and vice versa. As they become more standard, the assistant becomes more standard. This is not just a matter, though, of so these are cases of convergence in communication accommodation theory, adjusting linguistic practices to become more like
the person that we're talking with. Divergence is also a way to position ourselves and in particular to challenge and introduce social distance when we don't like someone and don't want to accommodate with them. So in this study also of Welsh, interviewees were recorded talking and were recorded as using and were analyzed as the extent to which they have a Welsh accent. They were interviewed, they were recorded talking as responses to 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And in each of these phases, they were asked different questions. And then later on, after they were recorded answering these questions, some respondents listened to their talk and rated them on how Welsh they sounded, how accented their English sounded as Welsh English. There were 2 groups of people. Everybody who was interviewed for this study, who participated as an informant and who was later judged for their how Welsh they sounded, was taking a Welsh language class. And they could be divided into integrative and instrumental learners of Welsh. This was on the basis of the motivations for their taking the class in Welsh. Integrative learners were people who wanted to learn Welsh for cultural reasons, for identity, for connection with family, because it's important as part of being Welsh and living in Wales that you speak Welsh. The instrumental speakers were people who were doing it for an external reason rather than an internal motivation. So they had a job where they had to interact with people who were L1 Welsh speakers, and therefore to be successful in their job they needed to speak Welsh. They were going for a promotion, and within their particular venue or milieu, it helped them to speak Welsh. So you have different motivations here. So the noteworthy thing is that here in phase 1 and phase 2, which are fairly neutral conditions, phase 1, I believe they're responding to some demographic questions and questions about their motivations. Phase 2, they're talking about their experiences with Welsh culture, experiences with Welsh, I think, something like that. And higher numbers here correspond to sounding more Welsh, to being rated as more accented as sounding Welsh. So in phase 1, which is a fairly neutral condition, the people learning Welsh for cultural internal motivations sounded a bit less Welsh accented when they spoke than the instrumental people. So they're talking English. The instrumental learners of Welsh, when they're responding, they sound more like they're speaking Welsh accented English than the integrative learners. Likewise, in condition 2, or phase 2, where they're again asking sort of neutral questions or answering neutral questions. The integrative sound speakers sound a little bit less Welsh accented as they're talking than the instrumental learners. But the crucial point of this test comes in phase 3, when the lead-in to the question task is the interviewer saying, even in the boardrooms of some of your own education departments, it is being said that Welsh is dying. Why can't you leave it alone? It is spoken by such a tiny proportion of people that it has one foot in the grave. Now, as I have already said, I believe to be realistic that the future of Welsh appears pretty dismal. So could I have your opinion concerning the survival and status of Welsh language in Wales? So the important point here is that the interviewer says this hostile thing that attacks Welsh and demeans it as a part of Welsh culture and challenges its validity as an object of study. And when this happens, you get a reversal of how Welsh accented the language of these respondents sounds. All of a sudden, these integrative learners who are learning Welsh because of cultural motivations and because of wanting to express Welsh identity, they increase how Welsh accented their language sounds. While these instrumental learners who are doing it for external motivations like job promotion or some other sort of goal like that's driven economically and pragmatically, they move farther away from sounding Welsh and sound more Welsh, less Welsh, and more generally English. And the only thing that can account for this difference is that suddenly
these people who are proud of Welsh and proud of their Welsh culture hate this speaker who has said these insulting things about Welsh, and so they're turning up, ratcheting up their Welsh identity and projecting themselves as more Welsh as a way to diverge from this speaker. This shows up in a fantastic study in the early 90s on African American English. The interviewee is one of the great characters of sociolinguistic interviews. She picked the name Foxy Boston for herself. And she was interviewed by different interviewers at different stages of this research. Roberta and Faye are both African Americans and have a fairly close relationship with Foxy Boston. And in her interview, you get regular occurrence of marked features of African American English. So you get I be on the telephone and he be going, so the copular be use. You have the question structure where there's the verb is not raised before the subject, and there's no do support, so where you went today as opposed to where did you go today. You have leveled past tense be verbs, so you wasn't at home, you wasn't at home, you wasn't at home, where was you at, which again is a feature of African American English. You have deletion of the copula in a few cases, but I've lost it and can't find it at the moment. Here in that boy on your tip, so rather than that boy is on your tip, the copulative be verb is deleted here. So you get regular occurrence of African American English features. However, when Foxy Boston talks with Beth, who's a white interviewer, and they have a good relationship, though not nearly as obviously convivial as Faye and Roberta, you have almost no features of African American English. So now you get the white English pattern of the third person singular be verb. You get that his name is Mr. Seagal. He's like really hard. Interestingly, you get more of this discourse marker like, which is in these interviews were being conducted in California, a salient marker of white feminine English at this time in California English. Again, the third person copular is regular agreement following the third person inflection pattern associated with white standard English. We're in college rather than we was in college. Again, third person singular agreement. So no features at all really in this passage of African American English. Again, the only difference is the same person talking to different interviewers, and more generally across features associated with African American English. Foxy uses them when speaking with an African American interviewer, and doesn't use them when speaking with a white interviewer. So across this range, audience becomes a very important factor in driving intra-speaker variation. So audience is a way to determine style. In the initial conceptualization that we talk about as audience design, our conceptualization of the audience that we're talking to causes us to move in the direction of their norms. Extrapolated to a larger level of theory, we get communication accommodation theory, where speakers converge and become more similar if they want to decrease social distance between themselves, or diverge and become more dissimilar if they want to increase social distance for themselves from each other. Bell provides one more conceptualization of this referee design, and the point of referee design is that this is still audience design, but that the actual audience doesn't have to be in front of us, and indeed we're not really accommodating or changing our speech, converging or diverging with the person per se who is our audience, but with a conceptualization of them, an idea of them. So we shift in the direction, if we're converging, or shift away from the direction, diverging, of the norms that we conceptualize for that person, rather than strictly speaking monitoring exactly what they're doing linguistically and trying to mirror them. That means that we can also accommodate to someone that's not present at all. So if while talking to students, I'm trying to sound like a professor, rather than shifting my language in the direction of the students that I'm talking to, I will shift my language in the direction of my conceptualization of what it is a professor sounds like, and I'll converge in the direction of that social idea of the norms of my conceptualization of a professor, and use that to mediate to my literal audience that's actually present. So referee design is just an extension of audience design, but rather than converging and diverging directly with the audience that's actually literally in front of us, we accommodate, we converge and diverge to norms of our conceptualizations of these references of social categories and references of people. And that's actually what our target for convergence and divergence is. This is a model that I provide for it, which is again, if we're the speaker, we're not in converging or diverging, moving strictly speaking in the direction of our addressee, but we're accommodating, converging or diverging in the direction of an external reference, some idea that we have of what the target is that we're talking to, and then use that to adjust our speech, which then goes back to our addressee. So we sort of mediate our interactions through a referee, an external referent that we're designing our speech to. So audience design is a very powerful reconceptualization and a challenge to Labov's model for style, the attention to speech model of style. But importantly, again, if we drill into some of the data that has prominent in the theory of communication accommodation theory and audience design and referee design, again, there's more going on under the surface. And what I point to here is that these are Bell's models, once again, for consonant cluster reduction on the New Zealand radio station and the different radio stations. And these are divided according to the individual broadcaster. And what's striking on this is that while overall you can see where the pattern emerged, where people use the more standard variant for the higher prestige station and the less standard variant for the lower prestige station. You can see that pattern here in SD. You can see that pattern here in TA. Maybe arguably you see it a little bit here in PB. Not so much in OJ, and really not at all in AF. AF didn't mean back then what it does now. It was just a person's initials. But this means, again, not everybody is inherently moving in the direction of an audience or a referee, but that actually individual speakers are doing very different things. This broadcaster, TA, seems to be really oriented toward changing their language norms, toward converging in the direction of the referee audience that they conceptualize themselves as talking to, while this broadcaster, AF, doesn't seem to be really bothered by it at all, and kind of does the same thing. And so this again calls into question the role of agency in determining variation. So again, even though Bell's model of audience design and referee design and the accompanying model of communication accommodation theory do give speakers agency in shifting their language according to the audiences they're talking to, it still kind of suggests that this is at some level an automatic process. That in the earliest model of audience design, inherently, I'll think about you as an audience, and whatever your norms are, I'll move in that direction. And that's for instance, in the Trudgill example of his analysis of T-glottaling. That seems to be what's suggested. I talk to somebody who glottalizes more, and all of a sudden I glottalize more. But individual speakers don't necessarily do this. And individual speakers and individual interactions may do this at different levels and for different purposes. Even at the level of communication accommodation theory, where you have these processes of convergence and divergence, the reality is more complicated. First of all, we may not both be mutually engaged in the same kind of process. So you can imagine very easily a situation where I really like you and you really dislike me. And so I keep trying to accommodate in your direction and you keep trying to diverge away from me. And we just sort of linguistically chase each other around. And communication accommodation theory doesn't clearly have a way to support this. It suggests if we want to decrease social distance, we'll accommodate. If we want to increase social distance, we'll diverge. Further, you can see that we do these in different directions. So again, to use the example of a professor talking to students, it may actually, even if a professor wants to be close, wants to have a good relationship, wants to be accommodating in the way that we do in this program and as we model it in our ethos, there still might be good motivation not for speaking more like students. And actually you may really have good reason to hate it if all your professors in Cal start talking exactly like you do, not the least of which it'll sound really silly when we talk about being bevved up and whatnot. And so these models are still denying agency and still denying individual patterns of variation and individual things that people do with language. More broadly, we recognize that style is not, despite how much I would like the world only to be linguistics, style is not totally dependent on language. And it turns out that people actually do things socially besides speaking. And that in fact, in constructing ourselves and interacting with the world, language is really just one of many options that we have to construct ourselves and present ourselves and negotiate our relationships with the world. So Penny Eckert, in her work in Detroit and a high school, and more generally, the model of ethnographic study that is exemplified by her work, demonstrates the role that different identity practices and different social practices might play in accounting for intra-speaker variation and accounting for the ways people speak. So in her work, Penelope Eckert embedded herself in a high school in the United States, and she basically, as a researcher, went to that school every day for a year and had no responsibilities except to go around and talk to the students and interview them and hang out with them and see what was going on. And Penny, unlike the rest of us, has the sort of personality where people actually like and tolerate her doing this kind of thing. And so, she was beloved by the students and sort of worked her way into all the groups. And she identified the social order of this high school, this primary school, secondary school, as being divided between two key poles on the social continuum: jocks and burnouts. Jocks were the motivated, college-bound, school-oriented students. So jocks suggests athletics, but the jocks weren't necessarily athletes. They were also high academic achievers, university-bound, participated in clubs, liked school, and had social lives that were largely tied to school activities. The other side was the burnouts, and these were not university-bound, didn't participate in school activities, rejected the school as a place, oriented away from the school for social activities, oriented toward inner city Detroit, and toward that. A lot of other differences are sort of surface level as opposed to actual. So there are associations, for instance, between burnouts and crime. And burnouts did engage in criminal activity and vandalism and sort of petty theft and that sort of thing. But that was really more of a social marker than sort of a moral thing as a way to reject and oppose authority. Penny also points out that the jocks and burnouts partied at equal levels, smoked at roughly similar levels, used drugs at roughly similar levels. So these are really sort of the difference between jock and burnout is a matter of positioning yourself as oriented to the school if you're a jock and oriented away from the school and toward inner city Detroit if you're a burnout.
Importantly, in this conceptualization, she notes that the geography, the landscape of the school has important centers and features that correspond to these social categories. So broadly speaking, the cafeteria was the domain of the jocks, and the courtyard outside, because they could smoke visibly, and the school wouldn't expel them for it. The courtyard was the domain of the burnouts. And so, any time of day, whether it was lunch or not, the jocks would be hanging out in the cafeteria, and during lunch, they'd take a long time to sit and socialize and this sort of thing. And conversely, the burnouts would be out in the courtyard. And this is the continuum of how many burnouts there are to how many jocks there are. 100% burnouts using the courtyard some, and 0% of the jocks ever being in the courtyard. So it's not just that this was burnout space, it's that if you were a jock and you needed to get from this hallway here near the center wing to the gym hall, you would intentionally walk way over here and go this way around so that you could avoid crossing through the courtyard, because that was burnout territory. Likewise, the burnouts didn't go into the cafeteria. They would go get their food and then go immediately eat in the courtyard. So burnout space, cafeteria, jock space. And then in this hallway in between, you get a steady decline. So there are students that don't fit clearly into either category. They're just, sort of semi-jock, semi-burnout, somewhere in between. And you actually get sort of a continuum of how much they appear in the courtyard and the cafeteria, and a continuum of where they appear in the space in between jock territory and burnout territory. Eckert, as part of her study, looks at how big people's trousers are, their jeans are, as you move from the cafeteria to the courtyard. So this work was done in 1980. This is at the transition between bell bottoms in the 70s and really tight jeans in the early 80s. The burnouts wore bell bottoms, and the jocks would wear the incoming fashion of the really tight jeans. And so Eckert does a measure of how much flare there is at the bottom of your pants, with lower numbers corresponding to tighter pants that are really tight at the ankles, and wide bells, higher numbers corresponding to really big bell-bottom trousers. And she finds a steady continuum that as you get closer to the cafeteria, the legs of your trousers get narrower, and as you get toward the courtyard where the burnouts are, the bottoms of your trousers get bigger, get more bell-bottomy, and this is a steady continuum. So it's not just that everybody in the courtyard has big bell-bottoms, everybody in the cafeteria has really tight peg legs. It's as you get closer to the courtyard, you position yourself by wearing jeans that have more flare and are more burnouty, and vice versa. As you get closer to the space of the cafeteria, your jeans get tighter, and it's not even a binary thing where burnouts wear bell bottoms and jocks wear peg legs. It's that the jockier you are, the tighter your pants will be, your trousers will be, and the more burned out you are, the wider your flare will be. So fashion is this external representation of group identity, and the width of the flare of your trouser bottoms corresponds to exactly how you're positioning yourself in this social continuum. And that social practice is mirrored in language. So on a number of variables, the most important explanatory factor in determining the extent to which students in this high school participate in the major linguistic innovation in this area, the Northern Cities vowel shift, is how much they identify with the burnout category versus how much they identify with the jock category. So jocks avoid the incoming language norms which are associated with inner city Detroit, and burnouts shift in the direction
of the incoming vernacular, non-standard, and stigmatized variant. So the social positioning, the same sort of social positioning that people are doing by wearing peg-leg jeans versus bell-bottoms, they're also doing linguistically, and people are adjusting their language according to the social categories that they're trying to position themselves with. So Eckert argues that style is itself central to accounting for linguistic variation. And so the progression here has been that in Labovian conceptualization, style was this sort of passive feature of I'm paying attention to my speech and I'll vary as a result of that away from the vernacular in the direction of standard as I pay more attention to speech. Bell suggests that our audience is what matters. And as we're thinking of an audience that uses more standard features, we'll adjust our speech in the direction of more standard speech features. As I think of an audience that uses more vernacular features, I'll adjust my speech in the direction of more vernacular speech features. Communication accommodation theory suggests we are still thinking about our audience and our interlocutors, but we engage in these mutual processes of convergence to close social distance by reducing linguistic differences, and divergence to increase social distance by increasing linguistic difference. Eckert points out that both of these are wrong and that style itself is a broader conceptualization, not of something that is acting upon speakers to cause them to change their language, but it's actually something that speakers construct as part of a matrix of identity practices to position themselves socially among and against other people. So we are, in her conceptualization, using language strategically to position ourselves as people in the world in comparison to the people around us. In this conceptualization, crucially, language is one element out of many choices. So we also have choices about fashion, we have choices about our appearance, we have choices about where we go to do things, and among that set of choices we have to socially construct ourselves as actors in society, we also have language. Because of that, the groups that we're in will determine different norms for different linguistic features. So the group of people that I associate will construct in-group meanings that are negotiated as part of the broader set of community meanings. And these small groups will form communities of practice with their own norms for stylistic variation and their own meanings for variables and what variants are associated with what different meanings. And as we move between communities of practice, or as the communities of practice we are in engage in different things, linguistic features might mean different things at different times. So for instance, if I'm in this sort of group moving around and and let's say I'm an in-betweener, and I come over here and use features of language associated with inner city Detroit, that will be a prestigious move because the burnouts I'm talking to will recognize that as being stylistically and socially connected and oriented to the inner city, and it will position me as one of them. It will show alignment and unity. If I use exactly the same feature over in this space, it will potentially be seen as orienting me away from this group because these are the jocks who reject that, who reject this orientation to the city. It will potentially mean that I don't want to participate in the school. I don't want to be seen as being part of this university-bound leadership, and it will have a hostile distancing function. So the same feature will take on different meanings depending on the situation, where I am, and what community of practice I'm working with, and what the rules are in that specific engagement. So again, this shows up in study after study, and this becomes a dominant paradigm in the 2000s and is still very central in sociolinguistic work today. So Buchholz's work with a community of practice that calls themselves the Random Range Supreme Club in a California high school, crucially construct themselves actively as nerd girls. So rejecting Eckert's idea that there are jocks and burnouts, and then there's sort of outsiders who don't fit into any of these. Buchholz points out that these nerd girls are consciously constructing themselves not as outcasts, but as actually proactively different from either the burnouts or the jocks. They're neither jocks in the sense that they're not oriented to the community, to the school. They're not oriented toward sports. They're not oriented toward sort of high prestige school clubs and activities. Yet they're also not oriented to the burnouts values of the inner city and rejecting school and not going to university. They occupy a different set of spaces. And as a result, these nerd girls participate in linguistic practices at different levels from all the other groups. So in some cases, they avoid linguistic features that are associated with the other groups. And in other cases, they introduce their own linguistic features that establish identity within the group. So among these, for instance, they use at high frequencies lexical items associated with very formal registers, so really fancy words where normally we use smaller words, as well as a lot of language play and a lot of hypercorrect spelling influenced productions. So it's not just a matter, once again, of sort of passively trying to adjust style on the basis of what's happening in the community around us or the speaking task we're in, nor is it a matter of engaging in practices because the particular community of practice we're in is engaging in those, but actually determining what the meanings of linguistic practices are on the basis of constructing a community of practice as different from other groups. Scott Kiesling looks at this in a fraternity, so once again we return to the form at the end of a present progressive verb, and finds he takes an ethnographic study and lives with a fraternity for a year and looks at a number of variables, among them this present progressive verb ending in different fraternity tasks like socializing, interviewing, and meeting. And as you'd expect, there's a community pattern across this fraternity of using the more vernacular, less standard variant n, run in, more in social functions like parties, using the most formal, least vernacular running in a relatively formal situation within that community of practice, a chapter meeting, and then at an intervening space between those two when being interviewed. So in a one-on-one conversation with Scott, they use at an intermediate form. So there's this community pattern that the group participates in collectively of adjusting their speech according to the formality of the situation. But you also get tremendous intra-speaker variation, which is a result in some cases of speakers consciously constructing themselves in difference to the norms of the task. So in the case of Speed and Mac here, they both increase their level of participation in the vernacular standard in relative to their own levels of production, and in this case here, relative even to everybody else's most formal or most vernacular use, and they become more vernacular in the relatively highly formal, highly standard setting of the meeting. And Kiesling analyzes this as a very conscious position to use this variable to construct their identities as working class and masculine in opposition to the norms of the fraternity. So this becomes a matter of individual agency in constructing yourself in divergence and in negotiation of the norms of the community of practice in different ways. Rob Podesva finds this in a vowel feature in California. So he looks at the vowel productions of one speaker engaged in different tasks and the extent to which he's participating in a regional change known as the California vowel shift. And he measures the speaker
and analyzes him according to three tasks. One is when meeting with the supervisor at work. One is at dinner with friends, so at a sit-down sort of restaurant dinner, and last, during a boys' night out, going to a dance club and dancing. And across all contexts, the speaker moves more in the direction of the incoming sound change as he moves toward these more social situations and moves toward the standard when he's in the task of the supervisor. So again, the important thing here is the speaker is actively using his language, and these are not features that somebody should have conscious control of. So boot, for instance, is how front your productions of the oo vowel are, and there's very little evidence that we can consciously control that. But despite this being an unconscious thing, the speaker is using these to index different personae for himself, and he has different sort of guises. That when he's at work talking to a supervisor, he uses a less vernacular, more standard set of acoustic realizations of the California vowel system. And as he moves toward different personae, he engages in more vernacular, more innovative acoustic realizations of the California vowel shift. And this is important because for this speaker, Podesva points out that he models himself as different people in these. So in the meeting with a supervisor, he's constructing himself as a persona of a professional, where at the other end of the continuum, the boys' night out, he's invoking a character that the speaker himself refers to as his gay diva persona, or his gay diva personality, where he's very exuberant and wild and dancey and has spike hair and loud clothes. And so his participation in the California vowel shift is directly predicated on the persona he's constructing for himself and the way that he's using this to engage with the world. So language is pointed to as a way to construct your identity and position yourself among other people in the world. And again, this shows up regularly across all the features of the California vowel shift, that more innovative, in Labovian terms, more vernacular productions are associated with the gay diva persona, and increasingly more standard, less innovative, less vernacular productions are associated, especially with the work persona. And the fascinating point here is that while all this move from attention to speech in the direction of audience design, and then style as a thing that speakers do to construct themselves as social actors, while this is all a response to Labov's work in 1966, there's a good case to be made that Labov anticipated this sort of work with his first study of Martha's Vineyard. In that study, he looked at a feature of I raising, so a word like price would be produced more like price. And what he found, the raise, the price production was associated with the traditional Martha's Vineyard dialect. And what he found was that residents of Martha's Vineyard, this island, who were planning to move to the mainland, moved away from that local vernacular price production and moved in the direction of the mainland standard, which would be something more like price. The islanders who planned to stay on the island or planned to go away to the mainland for university and then come back to the island, they increasingly adopted that local feature of the raised variant price. And therefore, the best way to account for whether or not they were participating in this local variant was by accounting for whether or not they wanted to stay on the island. So in Labov's very first study, which arguably even more than his New York City study, which created sort of variationist study, his earlier study, which many point to as the foundation of sociolinguistics more broadly, actually found this role for style, that speakers are participating in language variation on the basis of what they're trying to do socially. And so this move towards style that we get to in Eckert's work, Buchholz's work, Heesland's work, Podesva's work in the early 2000s was actually there from the start in Labov's work. Style, therefore,
has had a role in being central to defining sort of what we kind of think of as three waves of variation in sociolinguistics. A first wave that was based on big studies of urban communities and was really driven by attention to speech. A second wave, and this co-occurred with the move toward audience design, but had much more to do with neighborhoods, communities within larger communities, and the networks that existed among them, driven by ethnographic fieldwork as a second wave. And then the third wave that focused on style is driving linguistic variation in very, very small communities, labeled communities of practice, or in individuals. And style is sort of the central variable in accounting for variation within that third wave. So style, in one sense, is a variable within sociolinguistics, and it's one of many things that we can look at as driving intra-speaker variation. Much more broadly, though, it's been a fundamental element of the evolution of sociolinguistics over the course of the discipline, from Labov's early model that style and changes in intra-speaker linguistic productions were a result of how much attention to speech they're paying, to Bell's work in suggesting that we vary at an intra-speaker level as a result of audience, and later on in the communication accommodation theory models as a result of convergence and divergence as a reflection of our social distance. And then finally, as the central element among many other social practices that people engage in, that linguistic style is a function of the way that we position ourselves, define the communities of practice for the groups that we engage in, and also define ourselves relevant to those communities of practice within those communities of practice, and within and against the broader speech community that we're in. Style has been a central position in the evolution of sociolinguistics, and a key element to explaining how language works, how people do things with language, and how it is that people do language.